Inside of the pages folder, I've created a subfolder called API, and inside I've created a file called add-feedback.ts. So in the Next.js application, when you create a file inside of the API folder, the path name of that file is what's used to access that resource via a URL. So in this case, if we want to access this route, we will go home URL, as in localhost 3000/API/add-feedback. And inside of the file, you will create a route handler or controller to handle what happens when a user tries to access the route. So for this route handler, if the request.method is post, we're going to destructure all of these items off of the request body, and then we'll run a try catch block and try to take the values and save them to the database. And if this is successful, then we'll return the response.status of 200 and a JSON message saying feedback for the name that was posted was successfully added. Eventually, we'll use automated API testing to complete this, but to get started, we'll use Postman to manually test this configuration. So inside Postman, I've created a post request to the URL that we mentioned before, and I've clicked on the body, and I've clicked on raw, and for the drop down here, I've selected JSON, and then I created this JSON data here with all the values that I want to attempt to submit to the database. If everything goes as expected, then I should receive a response.status of 200 and a message indicating that the data was successfully saved to the database. So I'll click send, and I get a status of 200, so everything went okay. And I get the message indicating that the data was successfully saved to the database. I can further validate that this was the case as I go inside my MongoDB Atlas and refresh, and I see the data that I attempted to save actually is inside of the database. The next scenario I want to verify is if a user attempts to submit an email that is already in the database. If this is the case, we should get an error message indicating this is a duplicate key error, and when we see that, our server will respond with a status of 409 and a JSON message saying feedback for whatever the email was has already been received. I can easily test this scenario in Postman by simply clicking the send button with the exact same data that we've submitted before. So we get a status of 409 indicating there's some conflict, and we get the message saying feedback already received. We'll test one more scenario with our route handler. We'll test a scenario where a user attempts to submit data that is not valid, meaning we don't have specific required fields, or maybe we are trying to submit a phone number that's not in a valid format. We have code on our front end that checks and validates this data, but it's also important to validate these scenarios on the API side, because someone working on the front end can make changes to the code that will let these values slip through, but we ultimately want to make sure that our last stop, meaning the API, does not allow the data to be submitted to the database. So if we get an error message that includes feedback validation failed, then we're going to create a custom message saying missing one or more required fields and or a valid phone number, and we'll return a response status of 422 and a JSON message of what we have on line 31. So I can go and simply do something like take away the email field and try to submit the data, and we'll get a message saying that we're missing one or more required fields and or a valid phone number, and we also get a status of 422. I could also do something like take away the required email and try to submit an invalid phone number, and we get the same message and the same status message. So in summary, we use Postman to manually verify responses for 3 different scenarios with our add feedback route handler. Feel free to look around at other scenarios that we may not have tested for to see if you can add validation for those expected behaviors.